In revolutionary movements, it is common to face burnout, to lose sight of the goal, to become despondent at our prospects. This is natural. Everything around us is telling us we are doomed to fail because we represent a threat to the current order. For many budding leftists, a question also hangs in the air. Why hasn't it worked yet? If we are on the right side of history, if communism is the inevitable next stage in human development, why aren't we there yet? Or at least, why doesn't it seem more like that's the case? How is it that the Soviet Union could fall, that the remaining socialist governments have implemented market reforms in an apparent step backwards? It seems like capitalism will be around forever, that with the advent of better and better technology, its vice grip grows ever tighter. It isn't enough to simply explain that a lot of this anxiety stems from capitalist indoctrination and posturing, and often our comrades' answers to these questions seem lackluster or don't fully provide a satisfying response. Unfortunately, the short of it is rather unsatisfying. Some will say that the objective conditions exist for revolution, but that it comes down to subjective conditions. And it is the uncomfortable and plain truth that the reason it hasn't worked yet comes down to the fact that we have to make it happen. The words of Rosa Luxemburg hang more and more like a sword of Damocles over this planet's waiting neck. Except socialism or barbarism has become socialism or extinction, or truly, communism or oblivion. This video, however, will attempt to put forth a more filling answer, hopefully one that also helps our newer comrades in sketching out both the Marxist view of history and of revolution. By looking at our current moment and the tasks at hand from a historical perspective, it is easy to become too abstracted and slip into inaction, to ignore the active role we must take. This is not what we are advocating. Rather, we can gain an educated, measured revolutionary optimism through understanding that communism is, in fact, an inevitability, one that we can only build with our own hands. To do this, we will begin by laying out the Marxist historical perspective and the development of capitalism in short, then move into describing the current stage of parasitic capitalist imperialism and some tactics the system uses to maintain itself, and conclude by explaining how capitalism holds within itself the seeds of its own destruction, the proletariat's historic role in the building of communist society, and how we communists specifically can view our role. Be sure, however, that there are countless aspects of everything we will discuss today that we simply cannot cover, or else we'd be here forever. If you feel something is being left out, it is likely not because it's not relevant or even incredibly important to the argument at hand. It's simply for the sake of brevity in an already far too long piece. We should also note that we will not be discussing specifics of different socialist projects, so as not to distract from the point of viewing things on the scale of history. Today we will be going over 4 major points. 1. Capitalism developed out of the process of historical dialectics. 2. Capitalism is the endless drive to accumulate, and so it accumulates first nationally, then internationally. 3. Once it is run up against every border and a market has been introduced everywhere, its only possibility for continued growth is to eat itself, to destroy in order to create. 4. This only continues to fertilize the seeds of its destruction which lie latently inside of it. To begin with, what is historical materialism? Historical materialism is the name given to the Marxist theory of history, developed by Marx and Engels in their day and developed further by countless great names. It can be summed up incredibly short in the line many have likely heard before, coming from the Manifesto of the Communist Party, that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. It goes much deeper than this, however, establishing a methodical, scientific framework for understanding the underlying processes behind history, society, and revolution. Now, as a caveat, we must recognize again that there are many, many other writers who have contributed to the body of revolutionary work and should not be denied. Revolutionaries the world over, hardened in real communist practice both under capitalist dictatorship and at the helm of proletarian states. However, for the purposes of this work, we are primarily summarizing from Marx, Engels, and Lenin's elucidations of this theory, both because they make up its foundations, but also to prove the point that no matter how much things may change, their prescriptions are still more than relevant today. We explained briefly in our previous video why it is so essential to grasp the Marxist view of history, but it bears repeating. Historical materialism is one of the pillars of communist ideology, inextricable because it is the basis upon which we not only understand the processes of the past and understand our present situation and tasks, but also our future, how it must look, how it must be achieved. As Marx said, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. It is a definite economic mode of production which arises historically, just as all others have. We're also so insistent on this because a profound historical illiteracy abounds in even revolutionary spaces. It is not enough to know your history either. You must know the processes behind history, or you will certainly misunderstand your position, your responsibilities to the movement, and will remain more and more susceptible to corruption by bourgeois ideologies. As we will see, history is not a set of events, a list of facts to memorize. It doesn't matter how familiar you are with a history of a place. If you do not grasp at the underlying processes, you will never know the truth of a situation, and will be led astray by the flowering faces, perpetually distracted from tearing it up by the root. There is also a tendency in those anti-Marxists of all colors, from the so-called New Left to Marxist academics to out-and-out reactionaries, to characterize the Marxist view of history as one that simply reduces history into neat stages, that bisects history into civilized and uncivilized societies, condemning uncivilized peoples to domination and writes them off purely because they haven't achieved some sort of westernized standard of development. In a sterile manner, reducing history and diverse groups of people to bland economic statistics and strict definitions about stages of civilization. Hopefully, this video will dispel all of this nonsense and reveal Marxist history to be the fluid yet robust framework that it is. Nothing like what has just been said could ever remain in any real Marxist analysis of history. These notions are peddled by those who wish history could be molded to their own sensibilities, who believe history to be a game of heroes and aesthetics, and again just straight up anti-Marxists. To this we point to Marx and Engels, writing in the German ideology. History is nothing but the succession of the separate generations, each of which exploits the materials, the capital funds, the productive forces handed down to it by all preceding generations, and thus, on the one hand, continues the traditional activity in completely changed circumstances and, on the other, modifies the old circumstances with a completely changed activity. This can be speculatively distorted so that later history is made the goal of earlier history, e.g., the goal ascribed to the discovery of America is to further the eruption of the French Revolution. Thereby, history receives its own special aims. But in reality, what is designated with the words destiny, goal, germ, or idea of earlier history is nothing more than an abstraction formed from later history, from the active influence which earlier history exercises on later history. As a quick aside, before we really get started, many of these texts will refer to humanity as man. This is definitely an anachronistic practice, and to some it may rightfully seem close-minded and patriarchal. Rather than alter the text, I've chosen to leave it as it is, but whenever someone speaks of man or men, read humanity, all humans, and think of it more as a quirk of the time rather than something which invalidates what they're talking about. While there are incredibly necessary critiques that have been made of these revolutionaries we uphold, I don't feel that this is much more than them using the language of the day. Without ignoring the very real and prevalent patriarchal notions present, you have to understand the language in the context it was written in, rather than approaching it from your own context. In any case, let's ask again, what is historical materialism? Here, we'll avoid getting too bogged down in the philosophical and historical context of the formulation of these theories, but some context is necessary. You may have heard of Hegel, his dialectic, and Marx's flipping of it. This can seem incredibly esoteric, and Marx would probably say intentionally so as the philosophers have to justify keeping their jobs, but in reality it's fairly simple, and relevant more so to explain the ideological ground from which Marxist theory sprung. In a reductive sense, but concise for our purposes, Hegel was a German philosopher who developed the dialectical method for understanding reality, but who was limited by German bourgeois idealism. To him, the liberal democratic regimes that began to emerge with the development of capitalism represented the end of history, and in his dialectics, the ideas of a person influence reality. To Hegel, we shape the world around us through conscious thought. Marx rightfully showed that to be the wishy-washy, self-aggrandizing bourgeois slop it is. Still, he is recognized because the dialectical method was a significant development. Engels in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific explains this contribution. For the first time, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process, i.e. as in constant motion, change, transformation, development. And the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of all this movement and development. From this point of view, the history of mankind no longer appeared as a wild world of senseless deeds of violence, all equally condemnable at the judgment seat of mature philosophic reason, and which are best forgotten as quickly as possible, but as the process of evolution of man himself. It was now the task of the intellect to follow the gradual march of this process through all its devious ways, and to trace out the inner law running through all its apparently accidental phenomena. The materialist dialectic was born by flipping Hegel's description on its head. In reality, it is our material conditions that define our ideas, the economic reality of our existence that produces all of our relations with each other and shape the world around us. Before we truly delve into the materialist understanding, let's see what Marx and Engels were up against in their day, and who we're up against today. Unsurprisingly enough, our opponents have changed very little. The bourgeois lackeys that produce ceaseless tides of capitalist apologia under the auspices of history, who write the official line as the system's beatified historians, still follow very much the same line of thinking, reducing history to the history books instead of treating it as the living, bleeding creature that it is. In The German Ideology, Marx and Engels write that all forms and products of consciousness cannot be dissolved by mental criticism, by resolution into self-consciousness or transformation into apparitions, specters, fancies, etc., but only by the practical overthrow of the actual social relations which gave rise to this idealistic humbug. This is specifically calling out the philosophers who, as Marx put it, only seek to understand the world, not change it. They continue, the exponents of this conception of history, the bourgeois one, have consequently only been able to see in history the political actions of princes and states, religious and all sorts of theoretical struggles, and in particular in each historical epoch have had to share the illusion of that epoch. For instance, if an epoch imagines itself to be actuated by purely political or religious motives, although religion and politics are only forms of its true motives, the historian accepts this opinion. The idea, the conception of the people in question about their real practice, is transformed into the sole determining, active force, which controls and determines their practice. This is precisely highlighting the importance of Marx's flipping of Hegel's dialectic. Without understanding material conditions to be the deciding factor behind our reality, we are reduced to continuously falling into the same intentional pitfalls the bourgeois historian sets out for us. Whilst in ordinary life, every shopkeeper is very well able to distinguish between what somebody professes to be and what he really is, our historians have not yet won even this trivial insight. They take every epoch at its word, and believe that everything it says and imagines about itself is true. The Marxist, however, sees beyond the mythology, the self-aggrandizement, the metaphysical, fairy tale telling of history. They wield materialism with purpose. To explain this materialist part of historical materialism, and explain the distinction between Hegelian and Marxist dialectics with much more tact, here's the German ideology again. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. In the first method of approach, the starting point is consciousness taken as the living individual. In the second method, which conforms to real life, it is the real living individuals themselves, and consciousness is considered solely as their consciousness. This method of approach is not devoid of premises. It starts out from the real premises and does not abandon them for a moment. Its premises are men, not in any fantastic isolation and rigidity, but in their actual, empirically perceptible process of development under definite conditions. As soon as this active life process is described, history ceases to be a collection of dead facts as it is with the empiricists, themselves still abstract, or an imagined activity of imagined subjects, as with the idealists. If you're still confused regarding the idea of Marxist materialist dialectics, it should be sufficient here to leave another quote from Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. Nature works dialectically and not metaphysically, that she does not move in the eternal oneness of a perpetually recurring cycle, but goes through a real historical evolution. Starting from the beginning, the Marxist perspective seeks to, in a scientific manner, examine reality from premises which are not arbitrary ones, not dogmas, but real premises from which abstraction can only be made in the imagination. Of course, the problem with history is that you could start literally anywhere. More context is always needed, and we could really begin with the Big Bang. But for the sake of understanding and brevity, we've got to pick somewhere. Marx and Engels outline the premises we're beginning from in the German ideology. The first premise of all human history is, of course, the existence of living human individuals. Thus, the first fact to be established is the physical organization of these individuals and their consequent relation to the rest of nature. The writing of history must always set out from these natural bases and their modification in the course of history through the action of men. Men can be distinguished from animals by consciousness, by religion, or anything else you like. They themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence, a step which is conditioned by their physical organization. By producing their means of subsistence, men are indirectly producing their actual material life. The way in which men produce their means of subsistence depends first of all on the nature of the actual means of subsistence they find in existence and have to reproduce. This mode of production must not be considered simply as being the production of the physical existence of the individuals. Rather, it is a definite form of activity of these individuals, a definite form of expressing their life, a definite mode of life on their part. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. The nature of individuals thus depends on the material conditions determining their production. This production only makes its appearance with the increase of population. In its turn, this presupposes the intercourse of individuals with one another. The form of this intercourse is again determined by production. Let's drive this point home a little more, and then summarize. To quote at length from the German ideology, life involves, before everything else, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. And indeed this is a historical act, a fundamental condition of all history, which today, as thousands of years ago, must daily and hourly be fulfilled merely in order to sustain human life. The fact is, therefore, that definite individuals who are productively active in a definite way enter into these definite social and political relations. Empirical observation must in each separate instance bring out empirically and without any mystification and speculation the connection of the social and political structure with production. The social structure and the state are continually evolving out of the life process of definite individuals, but of individuals, not as they may appear in their own or other people's imagination, but as they really are, i.e., as they operate, produce materially, and hence as they work under definite material limits, presuppositions, and conditions independent of their will. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life and, next to production, the exchange of things produced is the basis of all social structure. That in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it is produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. A certain mode of production or industrial stage is always combined with a certain mode of cooperation or social stage, and this mode of cooperation is itself a productive force. Further, that the multitude of productive forces accessible to men determines the nature of society, hence that the history of humanity must always be studied and treated in relation to the history of industry and exchange. From the start, there exists a materialistic connection of men with one another, which is determined by their needs and their mode of production, and which is as old as men themselves. This connection is ever taking on new forms, and thus presents a history independently of the existence of any political or religious nonsense which, in addition, may hold men together. That was a lot of quoting, but when such better read and better spoken people have already done the intellectual heavy lifting, one can't help but let them speak. We also hope that you may come to your own conclusions about what they're saying. It certainly won't be the last time such a large chunk of text will be thrown at you. To finally summarize, however, the materialist conception of history begins from an analysis of material conditions. Our reality is defined by our relations to the current mode of economic production, of exchange, of subsistence, things that are defined by an ever-evolving process of development, not towards some perfect ideal, but in response to very real and definite factors of growth in technology, population, and division of labor, and society. Put more simply, with historical materialism, we can understand history not as a game of good and evil, of awesome battles and an idealized progression towards civilization, but as it is in reality, free from our prejudices. Society emerged when humans began to organize themselves, first in family ties, and the first productive forces were those which began to move us from simple subsistence. These historical processes are the amalgamation of huge amounts of human interactions, learning, and time, although they seem to accelerate as we grow more sophisticated. The means by which we keep ourselves alive, feed ourselves, clothe ourselves, house ourselves, and the vast networks and systems which spring up out of the advancement of technology and the division of labor make up and define our material reality. History is the sum of all these countless interactions, which manifest themselves as economic systems that are not the simple dreams of leaders, not some thing invented at whim, but definite systems which arise out of function, which are certainly submit to the vagaries and vicissitudes of individuals and human whim, but which are established, limited, and progressed by material reality. Agriculture, for instance, first arose in both sedentary and non-sedentary communities, and humans' new method of feeding themselves allowed for a new way of life, as people were able to feed themselves in more certain ways, causing populations to expand and new roles and ideas to emerge as the way we interact with each other and the world around us changed. You may notice that the question of class hasn't really been addressed yet. The moment that labor was divided amongst humans, class society emerged as different laws, both those passed by states and those arising out of definite economic systems, arose, defining different groups' ownership in relations to the means of subsistence, production, and exchange. This is vital to understanding Marxism, but we won't really discuss it at length until much later. Again, this might seem like a lot of information, but putting the historical materialist critique to work in analyzing the emergence and development of capitalism should help clarify everything further. As per historical materialism, every economic system that defines a certain era of human existence is something that arises out of and produces definite conditions. As Marx wrote, people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Capitalism is not unique in this, and in order to understand our current situation and what we must do to change it, we must use Marxism to chart its origins and the laws it operates under. The German ideology, again, provides us a great description of capitalism's origins. Manufacture and the movement of production in general received an enormous impetus through the extension of commerce which came with the discovery of America and the sea route to the East Indies. The new products imported thence, particularly the masses of gold and silver which came into circulation and totally changed the position of the classes towards one another, dealing a hard blow to feudal landed property and to the workers. The expeditions of adventurers, colonization, and above all, the extension of markets into a world market, which had now become possible and was daily becoming more and more a fact, called forth a new phase of historical development. Through the colonization of the newly discovered countries, the commercial struggle of the nations amongst one another was given new fuel and accordingly greater extension and animosity. Continuing on, the concentration of trade and manufacture in one country, England, developing irresistibly in the 17th century, gradually created for this country a relative world market, and thus a demand for the manufactured products of this country, which could no longer be met by the industrial productive forces hitherto existing. This demand, outgrowing the productive forces, was the motive power which, by producing big industry, called into existence the third period of private ownership since the Middle Ages. There already existed in England the other preconditions of this new phase: freedom of competition inside the nation, the development of theoretical mechanics, etc. Free competition inside the nation itself had everywhere to be conquered by a revolution, 1640 and 1688 in England, 1789 in France. Competition soon compelled every country that wished to retain its historical role to protect its manufactures by renewed customs regulations. The old duties were no longer any good against big industry, and soon after to introduce big industry under protective duties. Big industry universalized competition in spite of these protective measures. It is practical free trade. The protective duty is only a palliative, a measure of defense within free trade. Established means of communication in the modern world market subordinated trade to itself, transformed all capital into industrial capital, and thus produced the rapid circulation, development of the financial system, and the centralization of capital. By universal competition, it forced all individuals to strain their energy to the utmost. It destroyed as far as possible ideology, religion, morality, etc., and where it could not do this, made them into a palpable lie. It produced world history for the first time, insofar as it made all civilized nations and every individual member of them dependent for the satisfaction of their wants on the whole world, thus destroying the former natural exclusiveness of separate nations. It made natural science subservient to capital, and took from the division of labor the last semblance of its natural character. It destroyed natural growth in general, as far as this is possible while labor exists, and resolved all natural relationships into money relationships. In the place of naturally grown towns, it created the modern, large, industrial cities which have sprung up overnight. Wherever it penetrated, it destroyed the crafts and all earlier stages of industry. It completed the victory of the commercial town over the countryside. Its first premise was the automatic system. Its development produced a mass of productive forces for which private property became just as much a fetter as the guild had been for manufacture and the small, rural workshop for the developing craft. These productive forces received under the system of private property a one-sided development only, and became for the majority destructive forces. Moreover, a great multitude of such forces could find no application at all within this system. These extensive quotes are bringing us close to grasping capitalism's inevitable destruction, but that must wait until later. For now, we have established the fact that capitalism developed in England and France originally, out of the immense accumulation enabled by colonization, and the new capitalist order was only able to take root through the destruction of the old feudal system. The bourgeoisie, the class which represented the new economic system, had to harness the burgeoning proletariat and the long downtrodden peasantry in their revolution against feudal nobility. The form of governance which they ushered in to protect their new gains and new position in class society, the democratic republic, makes up the second half of the label of this period. Bourgeois democratic revolutions tore across the colonial world, beginning in the 1600s in England, through to the French and American revolutions, and continued through the 1800s as capitalism began to make itself universal. This is what Marxists mean when they say the bourgeoisie was once a revolutionary class, one that played a historically progressive role. It's not that they were revolutionary or progressive in the sense that we may think of these terms, but Marx and Engels give so much time to discussing the ideological and economic breakthroughs of the bourgeois democratic revolutions because they do represent humanity moving into a new period. The great men who in France prepared men's minds for the coming revolution were themselves extreme revolutionists. They recognized no external authority of any kind whatever. Religion, natural science, society, political institutions, everything was subjected to the most unsparing criticism. Everything must justify its existence before the judgment seat of reason or give up existence. Reason became the sole measure of everything. It was the time when, as Hegel says, the world stood upon its head, first in the sense that the human head, and the principles arrived at by its thought, claimed to be the basis of all human action and association, but by and by also in the wider sense that the reality which was in contradiction to these principles had, in fact, to be turned upside down. Every old traditional notion was flung into the lumber room as irrational. The world had hitherto allowed itself to be led solely by prejudices. Everything in the past deserved only pity and contempt. Now, for the first time, appeared the light of day, the kingdom of reason. Henceforth superstition, injustice, privilege, oppression were to be superseded by eternal truth, eternal right, equality based on nature and the inalienable rights of man. We know today that this kingdom of reason was nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie, that this eternal right found its realization in bourgeois justice, that this equality reduced itself to bourgeois equality before the law, that bourgeois property was proclaimed as one of the essential rights of man, and that the government of reason, the contrat social of Rousseau, came into being, and could only come into being as a democratic bourgeois republic. The great thinkers of the 18th century could, no more than their predecessors, go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. But, side by side with the antagonisms of the feudal nobility and the burghers, who claimed to represent all the rest of society, was the general antagonism of exploiters and exploited, of rich idlers and poor workers. It was this very circumstance that made it possible for the representatives of the bourgeoisie to put themselves forward as representing not one special class, but the whole of suffering humanity. Still further, From its origin, the bourgeoisie was saddled with its antithesis. Capitalists cannot exist without wage workers. And, in the same proportion as the medieval burgher of the guild developed into the modern bourgeois, the guild journeyman and the day laborer outside of the guilds developed into the proletarian. And although, upon the whole, the bourgeoisie in their struggle with the nobility could claim to represent at the same time the interests of the different working classes of that period, yet in every great bourgeois movement there were independent outbursts of that class which was the forerunner, more or less developed, of the modern proletariat. This point is also explained in the Manifesto. The modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. The bourgeoisie, historically, has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Here we can see the historic process of class struggle put into the context of the bourgeoisie and their struggle against the feudal nobility, but we can grasp as well the economic laws and basis that dictate capitalism. This is a topic outside the scope of this piece, although one that requires plenty of diligence and that we may cover in the future. Suffice it to say for now that capitalism is the naked drive for accumulation, or as Marx put it, dead labor which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. The bourgeoisie achieved a historic task in blowing away the feudal cobwebs, in inadvertently raising human living standards through the proliferation of science and large-scale industry, and, to tease a little more, sowing the seeds of proletarian revolution. As in all things, we as Marxists do not label these things as revolutionary in some emotionally charged sense, and we are easily able to see how utterly destructive their revolution and ensuing economic system is as well. But as Marxists examining history scientifically rather than emotionally, we are able to parse out the definite progression that has occurred, while still recognizing that the bourgeoisie has only intended to enrich themselves from the start, self-evident from the completely unsurprising about-face they made the very second they grasped power, kicking their allies in class war to the side. The point to be made is that we don't recognize the bourgeoisie's historic revolutionary role in the sense that we think of it as something to heap praise onto, or even harbor any positive feelings towards. We can simply see that they have ushered in an economic system which made it possible through even more developed and unabashed exploitation to produce a revolutionary class in the true sense of the word, the class which will end class society for good. Before that, however, we must gain a deeper understanding of the current stage of capitalist development and ask ourselves why, after endless and mounting crisis, it has not fallen. The fundamental law of capitalism, that of accumulation of surplus value, naturally leads capitalist development to grow at breakneck speeds, bloating itself until it reaches the borders placed upon the locale where it originates. At some point, it will run up against points of restriction, whether they be the nation's literal borders or its natural and economic bounds. This causes triumphant capital to look outwards, since, as Marx has just told us, it needs to keep consuming fresh blood for fear of total collapse. Capitalism, by the time Lenin wrote Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, had still not totally permeated the entire world, and it could be said that even today it has not totally conquered the planet. But what's more important here is that the economic system that is capitalism had to transition from its establishment to total dominance. And the transition stage of a totally victorious and simultaneously decaying capitalism is what Lenin sought to outline. To take a quick step back, Lenin tells us that Marx and Engels had already begun to discover what forms this would take, so let's quote from them to develop this further. The Manifesto gives us much to go off of. Under capitalism, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe, It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has agglomerated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. Note how he characterizes civilization as a bourgeois notion, one they impose upon the rest of the world. Pull that out if you're ever confronted by some academic weapon trying to tell you Marxism is moot because he was racist or something. In any case, Marx already knew that capitalism's natural tendency is centralization and consolidation, and how that necessarily manifests internationally as the violent establishment of a world order. He could not predict the future, however, or at least couldn't do so in perfect detail. Thankfully, Lenin came along to clear his vision. The early capitalism of big industry gave way to finance capital, and all the while kept touting the principle of free competition, a slogan already seen as the hollow lie it was in Marx and Engels' time. Lenin himself explains that imperialism is not the highest stage of capitalism in that it is some new, different thing, but that it is capitalism in transition, or moribund capitalism. It is only capitalism reaching a height in its development and transitioning towards its inevitable end. It's important to clarify as well that this decay does not mean that capitalism is not technically growing. In fact, the greater its growth, the faster its decay. Lenin's work seeks only to describe the characteristics of this stage in capitalist development, so let's summarize some of them. Lenin writes that capitalism is commodity production at its highest stage of development, when labor power itself becomes a commodity. The growth of internal exchange, and particularly of international exchange, is a characteristic feature of capitalism. The uneven and spasmodic development of individual enterprises, individual branches of industry, and individual countries is inevitable under the capitalist system, and, at a certain stage of its development, concentration itself, as it were, leads straight to monopoly, for a score or so of giant enterprises can easily arrive at an agreement, and on the other hand, the hindrance to competition, the tendency towards monopoly, arises from the huge size of the enterprises. The result of the transition from early capitalism's so-called free competition is immense progress in the socialization of production, and the monopoly created in certain branches of industry increases and intensifies the anarchy inherent in capitalist production as a whole. There are two vital things to understand so far. Capitalism, again, inherently concentrates itself, and in its development along these innate lines, inevitably leads to decay. We'll talk more about decay in a moment. Regarding the first point, Lenin writes that, since the specific political features of imperialism are reaction everywhere and increased national oppression due to the oppression of the financial oligarchy and the elimination of free competition, a petty bourgeois democratic opposition to imperialism arose at the beginning of the 20th century in nearly all imperialist countries. That is, imperialism naturally spawned a reaction to the violence and concentration it entails, taking the form of many calling for a return to the days of supposedly really free competition. We still see many people clamoring against monopoly capitalism in favor of the true spirit of capitalism. This is impossible. Well, you could theoretically do it if in some dream world our rulers let you, but it would naturally tend back towards imperialism and monopoly since this is just the natural consequence of capitalism. This inevitable concentration in turn inevitably expands the socialization of labor, as the more capital becomes concentrated, the more it continually narrows the scope of who can be called the bourgeoisie. This is a point we'll touch more on in the final section. It should also be noted that in capital's further concentration, the ever-tightening circle of rulers weld themselves more and more to the bourgeois state, resulting in its total capture by the interests of a united national imperial capitalist, where before it was still a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, but may have been subject more to the whims of individual capitalists. Before we finalize our understanding of the idea of decay and translate this into the present, we first need to outline another characteristic in capitalist development during the stage of imperialism. that of division and redivision. This will bring us up to speed. As we've seen, capitalism concentrates within the nation, and once it has reached a certain stage of concentration, it must begin looking outwards. And a major form this takes is in the export of capital, or as Lenin puts it, in a few countries capitalism has become overripe, and capital cannot find a field for profitable investment, turning to this export, which in turn influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported. Monopolist capitalist associations, cartels, syndicates, and trusts first divided the home market among themselves and obtained more or less complete possession of the industry of their own country. But under capitalism, the home market is inevitably bound up with the foreign market. Capitalism long ago created a world market. As the export of capital increased, and as the foreign and colonial connections and spheres of influence of the big monopolist associations expanded in all ways, things naturally gravitated towards an international agreement among these associations, and towards the formation of international cartels. Ultimately, the capitalists divide the world, not out of any particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to obtain profits. And they divide it in proportion to capital, in proportion to strength, because there cannot be any other method of division under commodity production in capitalism. But strength varies with the degree of economic and political development. Certain relations between capitalist associations grow up, based on the economic division of the world, while parallel to and in connection with it, certain relations grow up between political alliances, between states, on the basis of the territorial division of the world, of the struggle for colonies, of the struggle for spheres of influence. Thus, capitalism continues to run up against the borders of the natural world and enters into its highest stage, that in which we find ourselves now. The period under review is the final partitioning of the globe. Final not in the sense that repartition is impossible, on the contrary, repartitions are possible and inevitable, but in the sense that the colonial policy of the capitalist countries has completed the seizure of the unoccupied territories on our planet. For the first time, the world is completely divided up, so that in the future only redivision is possible, i.e., territories can only pass from one owner to another instead of passing as ownerless territory to an owner. So what do we mean then by decay? Lenin writes that, since monopoly prices are established, even temporarily, the motive cause of technical and consequently of all other progress disappears to a certain extent, and, further, the economic possibility arises of deliberately retarding technical progress. Once concentration has reached a certain scale, say the world order with America at the helm, capitalism in the imperial core no longer has any need to actually innovate. There is no competition, and so profits are no longer predicated on any drive for technological progress, however vulgar, and can simply stagnate while simultaneously pulling greater and greater profits out. We can see this everywhere in things like the tech industry. Although products continually worsen in quality, the profits only seem to keep rising, even more so the less they actually do. So, imperialism is the age of victorious capitalism, when it no longer needs to even pretend that it is a progressive, innovative force. Lenin describes this world order as the world having become divided into a handful of usurer states and a vast majority of debtor states. That is, the imperial core no longer develops or makes profits on the back of its own industry or invention, but purely through the exploitation of other countries and the illusions of financial capital. Capitalism is growing with the greatest rapidity in the colonies and in overseas countries. The struggle among the world imperialisms is becoming more acute. The tribute levied by finance capital on the most profitable colonial and overseas enterprises is increasing. In the division of this booty, an exceptionally large part goes to countries which do not always stand at the top of the list in the rapidity of the development of their productive forces. This is the essence of Lenin's parasitism, that the imperialist nations are parasitic upon the rest of the world, but we can go further. In the present, imperialism has gone beyond the parasitism of one ruling nation upon the subject nations, and has become self-parasitizing. As it reaches higher and higher levels of development, the process of accumulation seems to spin faster and faster, whipping itself into a fervor which lifts it further and further off of the ground upon which it first sprung, until it reaches the state we're currently in, an Ouroboros capitalism, where under the greedy eye of finance capital, profits become more and more disconnected from reality, and the inevitable crisis is staved off through smoke and mirrors. We have entered the era of true redivision, where all there is left to do is continually redivide the world and the world's economies in order to continue the illusion of continued growth. In the Manifesto, Marx begins to broach this problem while discussing the crises endemic to the capitalist system. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are fettered, and so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. As you may be beginning to see, the crux of the issue, what this entire video is about, is that capitalism is barreling itself headfirst into an inevitable final crash. The capitalist, aware of this yet obstinately refusing to see it, continues to stave off its certain end through the constant redivision of the world, the constant search for new markets, new sources of profit, to the point where destruction itself becomes a new source of profit. And why? Because, once again, if it does not keep generating profit, the whole thing will come crashing down. Now that there are next to no new, raw sources of profit to discover, they desperately search in an endless fervor for the next source which grows ever more fictitious, ever more ephemeral. The most minute increase in margins becomes the end to which they ransack and cripple every single aspect of reality in search of. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. This can be explained as well using basic Marxist economics. In Das Kapital, Marx outlines two forms of capital, constant capital and variable capital. We know that the value of all things exchanged on the market comes from the labor that has been put into them to transform them from raw materials which, make no mistake, do hold value. It's just that it requires labor to even get them into circulation, into commodities. Profits are reaped through the active labor of humans, who transform raw materials or commodities into something with greater value than whatever preceded it, to be sold on the market for higher than the capital put into it. It is the active labor of workers going into the commodity that actually creates this difference in value, that allows the capitalist to sell at a profit. The variable capital is the money the capitalist has to pay the workers in order to keep them laboring and, let's be honest, just barely above the line of subsistence. Whereas constant capital represents the means of production, the factories, industrial machinery, etc., whatever the capitalist has already paid for. They know these requirements of production are a constant in their calculations of profit. The means of production hold value, as machinery, for instance, is constituent parts were at some point built by human hands, and their depreciation is actually the machine imparting a part of that value onto the products. But again, this is all already calculated within the costs of production. This is why Marx also calls this distinction dead versus living labor. The dead labor, the means of production, cannot produce profits or new value, in part because they are not the thing being exchanged. What's the relevance here? Well, the capitalist strives to increase profits, and how can they do that? They've only got a few choices. Extend the working day so that more time can be dedicated to extracting surplus value beyond the time it takes to simply replace the costs of production and wages forwarded. This they do continually try, but it is less realistic, and despite their best wishes, they do need workers to stay alive. The major source of increased profits is the innovation of the means of production. You can extend the amount of time spent creating surplus value by making production more efficient, inventing new technologies that speed things up or make them more precise, make less workers necessary, etc. And this is their primary strategy. There are a couple problems with this, however. For one, this is a temporary fix. As quickly, competitors will adopt the new technology, or in the case of a monopoly, the entire industry will instantly be at the same level of production across the board, more or less. And this means there's only a tight window for huge profits to be made until everyone else adopts the new technology, or the price comes down closer to its actual price. The bigger problem is wrapped up in this. In increasing the efficiency of production, more commodities are able to be produced in less time, which necessarily cheapens the product. This does not even have to mean in the sense that the quality goes down. The issue goes back to the distinction between dead and living labor. As you begin to automate things, as you make production more efficient, less and less human labor is actually going into each commodity being produced because there is a greater volume of products being produced in proportion to the amount of living labor being expended, whether the workforce stays the same or lessens. The living labor put in has to be spread amongst more products. So, products become cheaper as their volume increases, as their production becomes more efficient. But, as the Manifesto says, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. As the bourgeoisie cannot help themselves but continue to improve production, because they want to pay less workers, pay workers less, wring out more profit, they transform more and more of the production process into dead labor, thus making the margin of surplus value tighter and tighter once past the initial glut and frenzy in profits. This is the essence of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is what it says on the nose of it. If you look at capitalist economy, the rate of profit, that is, how much profit, how much surplus value the capitalists are actually making over the variable and constant capital that they put in, is trending downward over time. This means that while profits continue to soar to new heights in numbers on the face of it, the reality is that the margin of profit is constantly narrowing. So then, how can they remedy this debilitating issue at the very core of the capitalist system, inherent to its natural principles? Through imperialism, through division and redivision, through the discovery of new markets, and further, through the destruction of dead and living labor, to be replaced with fresh blood, all for the opening of that slight margin where massive profits can be extracted in the moment. All they can do is continue to kick the can down the road, to keep finding new infusions of fresh capital, new sectors to free up in order to maintain the system and avoid the inevitable big crash. Let's see how this looks more in the modern day. Lenin explains how the boom and bust cycle contributes to the consolidation of capital in Imperialism. During periods of industrial boom, the profits of finance capital are immense, but during periods of depression, small and unsound businesses go out of existence, and the big banks acquire holdings in them by buying them up for a mere song, or participate in profitable schemes for their reconstruction and reorganization. This is beginning to get at the idea of self-parasitism, as crisis becomes a sort of opportunity for the capitalist. The name Amadeo Bordiga might be cause for consternation and jokes in many of you, but bear with me. He has some insightful contributions in this matter. In Property and Financial Capital, he explains that the entrepreneur needs, in addition to a factory and to machines, a liquid monetary capital, which he advances to purchase raw materials and pay wages, and then takes back when he sells his products. As with the factory and the machines, he is not necessarily the official owner of this capital either. Without losing ownership of the enterprise, which is protected by law, the entrepreneur or his company has this capital provided by banks, which charge an annual rate of interest. Having reached his ideal form, the bourgeois presents himself to us as free of and without immovable or movable property, without money, and above all without scruples. He no longer invests and risks anything of his own, but the total product remains legally in his hands, and therefore also the profit. This is another rehashing of dead versus living labor and capitalist parasitism in the age of the dominance of financial capital, but he and Lenin both make it clear that the dominance of the financial capitalist, while seeming to be in opposition to the industrial capitalist, actually represents the further combination of the two. In any case, he continues, the production of super profits swells more and more as we move away from the figure of the captain of industry, who was a source of socially useful innovation thanks to his technical skill. Capitalism increasingly becomes parasitical. That is, instead of earning and accumulating little while producing much and having much be consumed, it earns and accumulates enormously while producing little and satisfying social consumption badly. Again, we're still retracing our steps a little bit. Let's go further. Bordiga describes in an article titled Welfare Economics how one method the capitalist uses to stave off this collapse is through the invention of new products for consumption. New profits, new markets can be discovered through an ever-swelling swarm of artificial needs, and not being able to stop the infernal pace of accumulation, this humanity, parasite of itself, burns and destroys surplus profits and surplus values in a circle of madness, and makes its conditions of existence ever more straitened and senseless. In discussing the bourgeoisie's transition from a revolutionary class to complete parasitism, he asks, is it not fortuitous that an analogous cycle of capitalism has led to the present situation of the monstrous volume of a production, 9/10 of which is useless for the healthy life of the human species, and has given rise to a doctrinal superstructure reminiscent of Malthus's position, crying out, at the cost of raising the hounds of hell, for consumers who will swallow incessantly whatever accumulation spews out. The school of wellness, or welfare, with its claim that the individual absorption of consumption can rise beyond all limits, swelling the few hours left after necessary labor and repose with no less necessary steps and rights and morbid follies, actually expresses the illness of a society in ruin. Seeking to right the laws of its survival does nothing but confirm the course, uneven perhaps, but inexorable, of its horrible agony. But, even more telling of capitalism's day having come, of its complete turn to an Ouroboros form, of its self-parrotism, is its turn to destruction as a source of profit. War, disaster, crises of all forms have become the best source of new profit, and as capitalism grows, it grows ever more parasitic, and this will truly become the only means for creating new profits. Here's Bordiga's Murder of the Dead, written in response to floods in northern Italy. The appetite for surplus labor not only leads to extortion from the living of so much labor power as to shorten their lives, but does good business in the destruction of dead labor, so as to replace still useful products with other living labor. Depreciate rapidly. That is the supreme ideal of this grave-digging economy. Modern capital, which needs consumers as it needs to produce ever more, has a great interest in letting the products of dead labor fall into disuse as soon as possible, so as to impose their renewal with living labor, the only type from which it sucks profit. That is why it is in seventh heaven when war breaks out, and that is why it is so well trained for the practice of disasters. Car production in America is massive, but all, or nearly all, families have a car, so demand might be exhausted. So then, it is better that the cars last only a short time. So that this is indeed the case, firstly they are badly built, with a series of botched parts. If the users break their necks more often, no matter, a client is lost, but there's another car to substitute. They then call on fashion with a large cretinizing subsidy of advertising propaganda, through which everyone wants the latest model, like the women who are ashamed to put on a dress even if perfectly good, from last year. The fools are taken in, and it does not matter that a Ford built in 1920 lasts longer than a brand new 1951 model. And finally, the dumped cars are not used even for scrap and are thrown into car cemeteries. Who dares to take one saying, "You've thrown it away as if it were worthless, what harm is there in me fixing and reusing it?" He would get a kick up the backside and a jail sentence. So while the maintenance of the Poe embankments for 10 kilometers requires human labor costing, let us say, $1 million a year, it suits capitalism better to rebuild them all spending $1 billion. Otherwise it would have to wait 1,000 years. I hope you're thinking about planned obsolescence and, in addition, almost every aspect of the tech industry. It is the logical conclusion of all that we've just been discussing. To summarize all that we've just gone over, capitalism has reached its highest stage, its peak, its crescendo, and now all that remains is to stave off its inevitable collapse. It does this through brutalizing the parts of the world where the penetration of capital is not at such a high level to introduce new markets, inflating consumption by inventing new needs, and the destruction of old capital in order to free up space for new capital to worm its way in. In short, capitalism becomes parasitic and self-parasitizing. Today we live under an Ouroboros, a system eating itself alive to keep from starving. We aren't even discussing here the more political methods capitalism uses to stay in power, such as the democratic system, fascism, or the bribing of a labor aristocracy. Hopefully we have established that capitalism's day is coming, but the question that is the purpose of this whole video then remains. If it has not collapsed yet because it continues to fight off its certain doom, then how can we be certain it will collapse? That it won't simply continue to stave it off forever? That is to say, why is communism an inevitability? Why do we say that capitalism holds within it the seeds of its own destruction? Why is the proletariat the true revolutionary class, the first class to arise whose class interests can only be the destruction of class society? Just as we have learned with historical materialism, none of these things communists believe are upheld out of simple emotion because we want reality to bend to our will, because we think they sound nice. No. It is through the scientific materialist analysis of the very same laws we've just been observing that we come to these conclusions. To answer the prior questions, we'll have to do a little more rehashing, only because everything we've already discussed has pointed towards and teased the fact that capitalism has created and continues to furnish the conditions of its own destruction. Put simply, communism is a historical inevitability as the only possible mode of production for humanity to transition to from capitalism. As with any other mode of production in class society, capitalism is transitory, arising out of specific historical conditions, existing during a certain historical period, and it will fall just as certainly. This is because of the process of historical dialectics, because capitalism holds within itself and continues to sow the seeds of its own destruction, because it has produced the class which will undoubtedly abolish it and class society as a whole, for the first time breaking the historical trajectory off of the path it has been on since society as such first arose. This is what communists believe, and it may sound lofty and unrealistic, but it is the truth, more certain than any other future. Why is this? First, we must discuss how capitalism causes its own destruction, then focus in on why exactly the proletariat is the most revolutionary class, why its class interests can only be the abolition of classes on the whole, and finish by summing up our answer to the question of why and how communism is inevitable, and why and how, if this is true, we can maintain a pragmatic revolutionary optimism. Lenin wrote in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that in capitalism, it becomes evident that we have socialization of production and not mere interlocking, that private economic and private property relations constitute a shell which no longer fits its contents, a shell which must inevitably decay if its removal is artificially delayed, a shell which may remain in a state of decay for a fairly long period, but which will inevitably be removed. This is the crux of our argument, or, as Engels puts it succinctly in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, the mode of production rises in rebellion against the form of exchange. The primary contradiction in capitalism is that between the increasing socialization of production and increasingly concentrated private ownership of the means of production. As Engels explains, hitherto the owner of the instruments of labor had himself appropriated the product, because, as a rule, it was his own product and the assistance of others was the exception. Now the owner of the instruments of labor always appropriated himself to the product, although it was no longer his product, but exclusively the product of the labor of others. Thus, the products now produced socially were not appropriated by those who had actually set in motion the means of production and actually produced the commodities, but by the capitalists. The means of production, and production itself, had become in essence socialized, but they are subjected to a form of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals, under which, therefore, everyone owns his product and brings it to market. This can never sustain itself forever. The anarchy of production is an important aspect of this. Not only is the increasingly socialized production being limited by capitalist ownership, this ownership also completely misuses the immense forces at its hands through a form of production that answers to illogical market forces rather than the needs of humanity. The producers have lost control over their own social interrelations. Each man produces for himself with such means of production as he may happen to have, and for such exchange as he may require to satisfy his remaining wants. No one knows how much of his particular article is coming on the market, nor how much of it will be wanted. No one knows whether his individual product will meet an actual demand, whether he will be able to make good his costs of production, or even to sell his commodity at all. The contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation now presents itself as an antagonism between the organization of production in the individual workshop and the anarchy of production in society generally. Like we heard from Marx earlier, the conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. This contradiction repeatedly comes to a head in economic crises, as we know. Stagnation lasts for years, productive forces and products are wasted and destroyed wholesale, until the accumulated mass of commodities finally filter off, more or less depreciated in value, until production and exchange gradually begin to move again. Little by little, the pace quickens, it becomes a trot. The industrial trot breaks into a canter. The canter in turn grows into the headlong gallop of a perfect steeplechase of industry, commercial credit, and speculation, which finally, after breakneck leaps, ends where it began, in the ditch of a crisis, and so over and over again. This is not an endless cycle, however. Engels continues in a perfect elucidation of capitalism's inevitable collapse. The capitalistic mode of production moves in these two forms of the antagonism immanent to it from its very origin. It is never able to get out of that vicious circle which Fourier had already discovered. What Fourier could not, indeed, see in his time is that this circle is gradually narrowing, that the movement becomes more and more a spiral, and must come to an end, like the movement of planets, by collision with the center. It is the compelling force of anarchy in the production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority of men into proletarians. And it is the masses of the proletariat again who will finally put an end to anarchy in production. It is the compelling force of anarchy in social production that turns the limitless perfectibility of machinery under modern industry into a compulsory law by which every individual industrial capitalist must perfect his machinery more and more under penalty of ruin. But the perfecting of machinery is making human labor superfluous. If the introduction and increase of machinery means the displacement of millions of manual by a few machine workers, improvement in machinery means the displacement of more and more of the machine workers themselves. It means, in the last instance, the production of a number of available wage workers in excess of the average needs of capital, the formation of a complete industrial reserve army, as I called it in 1845, available at the times when industry is working at high pressure, to be cast out upon the street when the inevitable crash comes, a constant dead weight upon the limbs of the working class in its struggle for existence with capital, a regulator for keeping of wages down to the low level that suits the interests of capital. He goes further. On the one hand, therefore, the capitalistic mode of production stands convicted of its own incapacity to further direct these productive forces. On the other, these productive forces themselves, with increasing energy, press forward to the removal of the existing contradiction, to the abolition of their quality as capital, to the practical recognition of their character as social production forces. Lenin builds on this in Imperialism, explaining that capitalism in its imperialist stage leads directly to the most comprehensive socialization of production. It, so to speak, drags the capitalists against their will and consciousness into some sort of a new social order, a transitional one from complete free competition to complete socialization. Production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. The social means of production remain the private property of a few. The general framework of formally recognized free competition remains, and the yoke of a few monopolists on the rest of the population becomes 100 times heavier, more burdensome and intolerable. The more capitalism is developed, the more strongly the shortage of raw materials is felt. The more intense the competition in the hunt for sources of raw materials throughout the whole world, the more desperate the struggle for the acquisition of colonies. As the Manifesto states, the more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. Yet, as with the feudal stage before, at a certain stage in the development of these means of production and of exchange, relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Something that is vital to understand in the current moment is that the level or intensity of exploitation does not correlate with living standard. Exploitation in this case is simply an economic term to describe the rate or level of surplus value being extracted. It can, on the whole, only increase as capitalism develops, and one can be more and more economically exploited even while their amenities and living standards may seem to rise, as in the imperial core. This is, in fact, only further confirmation of our theory that the capitalist system is becoming more and more outstripped by the development of productive forces, that in the methods of production lie the seeds of the new world, that they are blooming more and more, making the capitalist more and more an archaic, anachronistic form that is simply trying harder and harder to grasp onto its last shreds of relevance as the world continues to pass it by into a new form of association. Capitalism's usefulness has long since slipped into the past as the flash in the pan it was, and now only serves as a limit, an irrational despot sitting on its hoard, one that cannot hope to maintain its position forever, making its destruction more certain the more time goes on, the more it develops itself. The biggest seed, however, we have yet to discuss, the revolutionary proletariat. As the Manifesto explains, the weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapons that bring death to itself, It has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. Why is the proletariat the only truly revolutionary class? Because it is the first class in history to arise whose class interests can only be the abolition of class society itself. Because capitalism produces and expands the proletariat, as it has produced and expanded the socialization of production. What does this mean, though? Why is it true? Engels writes in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific that the contradiction between socialized production and capitalistic appropriation manifested itself as the antagonism of proletariat and bourgeoisie. And this is a great place to start us off. The class struggle is the physical manifestation of the conflict between the current mode of production and the development of productive forces, of the new world struggling to be born out of the old. How is this different from any of the preceding class conflicts, though? As the Manifesto explains it, our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. The proletariat, that manifestation of the mode of production rebelling against the form of exchange, is alone a really revolutionary class, because the other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. Just as the means of production grow more and more socialized, capitalism cannot help but create more and more proletarians as it both raises sections of the world out of feudalism and concentrates itself more, turning peasant and noble, petty bourgeois and bourgeois into a single proletariat. They can stave off destruction through bribes and partial redistribution of wealth to lower class consciousness and create new capitalists, but the trend is still proletarianization, just as it is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The circle only grows narrower. As the Principles of Communism states, everywhere the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeoisie. In proportion as the bourgeoisie grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. For, since the proletarians can be employed only by capital, and since capital extends only through employing labor, it follows that the growth of the proletariat proceeds at precisely the same pace as the growth of capital. The Manifesto gives us a further clarity on this rule of capitalist development, through to the revolutionary confrontation. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all time with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie, and, we may add, the weapons quite literally in the form of arms. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists, who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. The proletariat's primary revolutionary quality, though, comes from the fact that, once again, its only true interest can be the abolition of classes altogether, and this is what makes it special, that the consciousness of this class has manifested as revolutionary communism, the doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat, the abolition of the present state of things. Communists, as with all other things, do not believe this out of some mystical wish, but because this is plain reality. Our beliefs have not arisen from a single person, from some spark of genius, but because humanity has finally reached the point where it is possible to dream of and achieve a society without exploitation, or as Marx writes, the theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, explains that the abolition of classes in society presupposes a degree of historical evolution at which the existence not simply of this or that particular ruling class, but of any ruling class at all, and, therefore, the existence of class distinction itself, has become an obsolete anachronism. It presupposes, therefore, the development of production carried out to a degree at which appropriation of the means of production and of the products, and, with this, of political domination, of the monopoly of culture, and of intellectual leadership by a particular class of society, has become not only superfluous but economically, politically, intellectually a hindrance to development. Like every other social advance, becomes practicable not by men understanding that the existence of classes is in contradiction to justice, equality, etc., not by the mere willingness to abolish these classes, but by virtue of certain new economic conditions. And these new economic conditions have developed far, far beyond what these men writing in the 1800s could clearly see. The seeds only grow more fertile. As they wrote in the German ideology, in all revolutions up till now, the mode of activity always remained unscathed, and it was only a question of a different distribution of this activity, a new distribution of labor to other persons, whilst the communist revolution is directed against the preceding mode of activity, does away with labor, and abolishes the rule of all classes with the classes themselves, because it is carried through by the class which no longer counts as a class in society, is not recognized as a class, and is, in itself, the expression of the dissolution of all classes, nationalities, etc. within present society. Why is this so? Let's get to the core of the issue of the proletariat, of why they can only seek the abolition of class society. All of this follows from the logic of all preceding class conflict and follows the very same rules. But the proletariat is the first class which owns nothing but their own labor, and as such can only fulfill their historic role as the revolutionary class in the coming class struggle by becoming the masters of the productive forces of society. The German ideology goes deeper on this. The only connection which still links them with the productive forces and with their own existence, labor, has lost all semblance of self-activity and only sustains their life by stunting it. While in the earlier periods, self-activity and the production of material life were separated, in that they devolved on different persons, and while, on account of the narrowness of the individuals themselves, the production of material life was considered as a subordinate mode of self-activity, they now diverge to such an extent that altogether material life appears as the end, and what produces this material life, labor, which is now the only possible but, as we see, negative form of self-activity, as the means. That is to say, for the first time, work has become the means to the end of material life via the separation of labor from its product. Labor has become the only way for the proletariat to assure their existence, whereas in all preceding modes of production, the oppressed classes retained some property or means of production, not out of the kindness of their masters' hearts, but due to the lack of development of productive forces. And so, the socialization of production has produced a class which owns no real property, which has no access to the means of production, subsistence, and distribution except by slowly infusing them with their own flesh and blood, which grows more and more into the single majority as capitalism develops, and as a result, cannot free itself but by abolishing private property as such, when all preceding economic revolutions simply reallocated these means. The Manifesto tells us that the proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of our present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole superincumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Or, as Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific puts it, whilst the capitalistic mode of production more and more completely transforms the great majority of the population into proletarians, it creates the power which, under penalty of its own destruction, is forced to accomplish this revolution. Finally, another summary from the German ideology on this topic, put further into the framework of historical materialism. Only the proletarians of the present day, who are completely shut off from all self-activity, are in a position to achieve a complete and no longer restricted self-activity, which consists in the appropriation of a totality of productive forces and in the thus postulated development of a totality of capacities. All earlier revolutionary appropriations were restricted. Individuals whose self-activity was restricted by a crude instrument of production and a limited intercourse appropriated this crude instrument of production and hence merely achieved a new state of limitation. Their instrument of production became their property, but they themselves remained subordinate to the division of labor and their own instrument of production. In all expropriations up to now, a mass of individuals remained subservient to a single instrument of production. In the appropriation by the proletarians, a mass of instruments of production must be made subject to each individual and property to all. Modern universal intercourse can be controlled by individuals, therefore, only when controlled by all. And so, we reach our conclusions to this lengthy answer to the question of communism's historical task, its inevitability, and how the struggle progresses on a historical scale. We have established the proletariat's truly revolutionary role, but then what is the role of us communists? How can we orient ourselves properly in face of the historic task in front of us? Marx and Engels correctly highlight in the German ideology that it is only possible to achieve real liberation in the real world and by employing real means. Liberation is a historical and not a mental act, and it is brought about by historical conditions. Those historical conditions have only grown more and more ripe as time has gone on, as capitalism develops. This may be hard to see, especially in places like the United States, where communists have been so thoroughly purged and corrupted by opportunism and revisionism in all its forms, but it is nevertheless ultimately true, perhaps even more so the more we are repressed. The unstemmable red tide will inevitably sweep over the world, but our answer can be put this simply: if we don't hit it, it won't fall. Why, though, is it communism that is the true doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat? Many accuse us of worshipping Marx, thinking of the ideology as simply one amongst many others, simply one way of interpreting the world. This cannot be further from the truth. Communists are the self-conscious proletariat. Communism the proletariat's finest, most comprehensive weapon in its struggle against the class enemy. In light of the class struggle beginning in England with the imposition of capitalism, and resting upon the understanding that all hitherto history is the history of class struggles, Engels writes in Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific that, from that time forward, socialism was no longer an accidental discovery of this or that ingenious brain, but the necessary outcome of the struggle between two historically developed classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Its task was no longer to manufacture a system of society as perfect as possible, but to examine the historico-economic succession of events from which these classes and their antagonism had of necessity sprung, and to discover in the economic conditions thus created the means of ending the conflict. He continues, active social forces work exactly like natural forces, blindly, forcibly, destructively, so long as we do not understand and reckon with them. But, when once we understand them, when once we grasp their action, their direction, their effects, it depends only upon ourselves to subject them more and more to our own will, and, by means of them, to reach our own ends. And this holds quite especially of the mighty productive forces of today. As long as we obstinately refuse to understand the nature and the character of these social means of action, and this understanding goes against the grain of the capitalist mode of production and its defenders, so long these forces are at work in spite of us, in opposition to us, so long they master us, as we have shown above in detail. But when once their nature is understood, they can, in the hands of the producers working together, be transformed from master demons into willing servants. The difference is as that between the destructive force of electricity in the lightning and the storm, and electricity under command in the telegraph and the voltaic arc. The difference between a conflagration and fire working in the service of man. With this recognition, at last, of the real nature of the productive forces of today, the social anarchy of production gives place to a social regulation of production upon a definite plan, according to the needs of the community and of each individual. Then the capitalist mode of appropriation, in which the product enslaves first the producer and then the appropriator, is replaced by the mode of appropriation of the products that is based upon the nature of the modern means of production. Upon the one hand, direct social appropriation as means to the maintenance and extension of production. On the other, direct individual appropriation as means of subsistence and of enjoyment. And finally, the new productive forces have already outgrown the capitalistic mode of using them, And this conflict between productive forces and modes of production is not a conflict engendered in the mind of man, like that between original sin and divine justice. It exists, in fact, objectively, outside us, is nothing but the reflex in thought of this conflict in fact. Its ideal reflection in the minds, first of the class directly suffering under it, the working class. Lenin, too, having described capitalism's latest phase, its transitional imperialist stage, reminds us that, as much as capitalism may change, the fundamental struggle remains so long as class society exists. International cartels show to what point capitalist monopolies have developed, and the object of the struggle between the various capitalist associations. This last circumstance is the most important. It alone shows us the historico-economic meaning of what is taking place, for the forms of the struggle may and do constantly change in accordance with varying, relatively specific and temporary causes, but the substance of the struggle, its class content, positively cannot change while classes exist. The Manifesto furnishes us with these incisive, concise lines which tell us our position and our role. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand, practically, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. And the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Put simply by Irish communist James Connolly, our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth. The bourgeoisie will always tell the world that we communists do not represent the proletariat, that classes can work together, that we must moderate our positions. But especially once you can view the struggle on the historic scale, it becomes ever more evidently clear that communism is the natural outcropping of the proletariat, of class war to come, the only thing that can truly liberate humanity from class oppression, from irrational production. The only thing that can satisfy the proletariat is their dictatorship and subsequent abolition. Anything short of this only serves to neuter and hold back the inevitable flow of history, but only for a time. Let's end this already far too lengthy piece with some summary and inspiration. To reiterate, as capitalism develops, exploitation develops and increases. This is not in the brutal sense. The Third World still bears the brunt of the most raw and heavy-handed exploitation. This is precisely because capitalism must establish itself, must develop itself from crude to sleek. In the most developed places, the exploitation becomes more and more efficient, more and more streamlined, and yet more and more all-encompassing. It learns to hide itself better, to conceal itself in an endless wash of commodities, issues, and justifications, but this does nothing to address the fundamental contradictions of capitalism. It only staves off its destruction. The margins only tighten, being temporarily widened through crisis and controlled demolition, only to continue clamping down on the capitalist's neck with that cold, unthinking certainty of historical development. As capitalism develops, more proletarians are created. In its endless drive for accumulation, capital and the system of capitalism concentrate more and more, forcing more and more people out of the owning class and into subservient, if still auxiliary classes, but in the majority towards proletarianization. The proletariat is the one class that owns nothing, that has in its consciousness created the program which will abolish class society, that for the first time has grasped at the end of the till now eternal class conflict. And as capital grows, it only adds to their ranks. It can stave off its destruction by infusing the bourgeoisie with new blood, new divisions of the world, but it can only head straight for its own collapse. As the productive forces swell to bursting, the means of production screeching with their misuse as they strain under the weight of both capitalism and the burgeoning communist future. To answer the question, why haven't we won yet? The communist movement is the only path forward for humanity other than its total annihilation. There may have been bloody setbacks, but as Marx says, it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. The answer, uncomfortable for some, is that we must look at history as communists, as an active process, and reconcile both the historic scale and our immediate present. We must purge ourselves of all mysticism, all vestiges of bourgeois ideology, and familiarize ourselves with the true materialist outlook. It's not that we should become unfeeling automatons. Rather, that being able to view the economic processes without emotion is precisely what enables us to feel with much deeper clarity, certainty, and truth both our exploitation and our inevitable victory. We have all the tools we need to win, and capitalism forces itself into giving us more and more opportunities as it barrels headfirst into crisis. It is our responsibility as the conscious working class to limit the damage of these crises by cutting them off as they happen, which can happen only by taking advantage of them to establish the new world, starting with the conquest of power. Whether it is a massive crash or a creeping exploitation, capitalism continues to furnish us with the means to overthrow it. It simply takes action, unambiguous action, a steeled heart working in league with our comrades to win the world. It cannot be accomplished alone, but we already number in the many millions, and the billions of proletarians, no matter how they may trudge through the bog of indoctrination, are our lifeblood, a blood which grows only stronger, more furious. In the ceaseless tension between preparation and execution, there lies the Communist Party's tension between appealing to the masses, building revolutionary consciousness, and going on the attack. In any and all periods, the party's prime directive must be combat or death, to push forward the class struggle in shameless, unequivocal terms. It must become an organization capable of wielding the state machinery, of directing the revolution, but it must never become comfortable in its preparation. The point of preparation is, and always must be, to agitate for crisis, for class war, to further lay bare the naked class antagonisms, to make ever more excruciatingly clear the inevitable combat to come, and to prepare the proletariat for its leading role in this combat. We'll finally finish with a rousing version of the speech delivered by Patrick Pearse at the funeral of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, an Irish Republican. Although Pearse was an Irish nationalist and not a communist, the sentiments he expresses regarding the Irish people's revolutionary struggle against England mirror quite well our feelings regarding the historical process and necessity of communist revolution. Just replace in your mind the nationalist terms with communist ones, not Ireland, not Fenians, but the proletariat and the international communist movement. Thank you for watching.
The defenders of this realm have worked well in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, think that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace.